Prom night is history now. Pundits have been saying for centuries that time heals all wounds, but the hurt of this small western Maine town may be mortal. Well, that's it. That's all he wrote. We are here, of course, for the third and final part of the read-along series for Carrie. We will be back with a review, a book review, an opening paragraph video, and a few other things, odds and ends to clean up around this series as we go. But we are here for the wreckage part of this novel, the aftermath part of this novel, and there will be 3 parts to this video: a So What Happened recap of this portion of the novel, a literary criticism portion where we talk about all of the literary goings-on in this novel, or in the third part of this novel, and finally the Writer's Corner section where we talk about all of the things we can learn from this part of the novel as writers ourselves. So, what happened? We open with the cold, hard facts, a death certificate for Carrie White. We then start to get accounting from the media. There are 409 dead, with 49 still missing. Industry is dead as well. The mills have lost workers, some to the event itself, others have given up the ghost, as they say. People are leaving the town even if they weren't directly affected, if there is such a thing. Staff from the school, such as Miss Desjardins and Principal Grail, resign. People have graffitoed the place where Carrie's house had stood. So there are 4 talking points that I want to get to from this abbreviated chapter, and the first comes to us on page 283 of the standard print edition, and it reads as such: "The town's major industry, Chamberlain Mills and Weaving, still stands, untouched by the fire that raged over much of the town on those 2 days in May. But it has only been running 1 shift since June 4th, and according to the mill president, William A. Chambliss, further layoffs are a strong possibility." "We have the orders," Chambliss said, "but you can't run a mill without people to punch the time clock." "We don't have them. I've gotten notice from 34 men since August 15th. The only thing we can see to do now is close up the dye house and job our work out. We'd hate to let the men go, but this thing is getting down to a matter of financial survival." It is interesting to get this bit from the novel itself. We don't often get, like this chapter says, the wreckage. We don't get the aftermath. We don't get the follow-up. We don't get what happens in the wake of these strange occurrences, if it's science fiction, these horrific occurrences, if it's horror. This novel really is somewhere in between. But work goes on where it can. The supply chain starts with labor. This incident seems to cause a downward spiral on the entire town. A very interesting bit of insight, from Stephen King. That is, so that is pardon the pun, a novel bit of insight from Stephen King as far as what comes after the novel itself transpires, if you will. But the next note that I have here is something that is perhaps a little bit short-sighted from the author if he were trying to make this novel timeless. It happens on that very same page. In fact, it happens at the beginning of that very next paragraph, and it reads as such: "Roger Fearon has lived in Chamberlain for 22 years and has been with the mill for 18 of those years. He has risen during that time from a third-floor bagger making 73 cents an hour to dye house foreman. Yet he seems strangely unmoved by the possibility of losing his job. I'd lose a damned good wage." I believe this goes on. Yeah. Fearon said, "It's not something you take lightly. The wife and I have talked it over. We could sell the house. It's worth $20,000 easily. And although we probably won't realize half of that, we'll probably go ahead and put it up. It's worth $20,000 easy, he says, afraid to lose his good-paying 74 cents an hour job. This novel was published in 1974. What a difference 50 years makes. The danger of putting your money in the bank, by the way, putting your money in the bank where you're not earning interest, where it's not growing dividends, where it's not X, Y, and Z. Imagine you had saved half of your earnings in 1974 from a good-paying 74-cent an hour job. Well, what would that be worth now? You lived on half of your income, right? You lived a very stingy life on half of your income, but you put your money in the bank. And inflation took everything away. It's strange. Supply chain and inflation. I made a quip about Stephen King wanting to make this a timeless novel and perhaps failing to do so. But sitting here in 2024, all of these worries about supply chain and inflation, maybe he did just that. The more things change, the more they stay the same, Here's an interesting thing. Say this fella lived in an average house in Chamberlain, Maine, right? Isn't that right? Chamberlain, Maine. So say he lives in an average house, $20,000. That house was. Okay, cool. $20,000 for an average house in that town. Today, if the internet tells me correctly, the average house in Chamberlain, Maine, I want you to guess what the average house in Chamberlain, Maine costs today. $20,000 in 1974. We're assuming that was an average house. Maybe it was a little more expensive, maybe it was a little bit less expensive. Probably you're looking at average, right? You have someone who is genuinely writing the everyman into his novel, saying that his house is worth $20,000. The average house in Chamberlain, Maine today costs $407,143. That is a 20x. That is a 20x. And they wonder why millennials are disheartened by the economy. They wonder why Gen Z refuses to buy into the economy. It's this. We will never own property. Most of us will never own property. The average house has nothing to do with the average wage. The average wage in probably the average wage in America is like 50,000, I think, is average. So a $407,000 average house means that your house costs on average eight times the average wage, a little bit over 8 times the average wage. If it's 50, I think it's about 50, something like that. But wow, wooey. Oh yeah, I got it on there. Look at that. Knew what I was going to say. Page 288. We have the penultimate talking point for this, the final chapter of Carrie. From Slang Terms Explained, A Parent's Guide by John R. Coombs, New York Lighthouse Press, 1985, page 73. To rip off a Carrie. To cause either violence or destruction, mayhem, confusion. 2. To commit arson. From Carrie White, 1963 to 1979. So first off, this is written in future tense. The novel was published in 1974. I don't know if you caught that throughout the novel. Little bits of future tense going on. The 1985 publication date for a Slang Terms Explained book. Interestingly, in 1985 would have been when Stephen King published Skeleton Crew. It was in the middle of an incredible run from Stephen King, writing novel after novel after novel after novel, 2-3 novels a year sometimes. Just an incredible run. But anyway, it is interesting to see Stephen King talking. This is a gutsy choice by the author to project something entering the mainstream from his novel, setting up a world. So in a way, you have a novel that's fantasy a little bit, right? Projecting into the future something which is to be, it's a little bit loosely fantasy. The idea of telekinesis, loosely fantasy. The explanations in the novel, however, the idea of the attempt to explain what the telekinesis is, you get into a little bit of science fiction. Obviously, with Carrie, you have a horror novel. And then you get into the fact that you have a coming of age story, right? So there's a lot of different, and we'll get into this in the review, a little bit of an epistolary as well, but interesting from the author here. And then look, I can't not say something about this. I can't not. So if you are a huge Stephen King fan, which let's face it, if you are 3 episodes into a series on Carrie, not his most well-read novel, probably you are. Just note, I am not saying this to criticize Stephen King necessarily as a person. I am saying this because it seems Stephen King criticizes others as people. Okay? So I'm setting that out there. And no, I'm not talking about anything on Twitter. I'm not talking about anything like that. Although it could be construed if you were on the receiving end of this bit of commentary. And by the receiving end, I mean the person that Stephen King is seemingly talking about here. Page 289 into 290. This is a letter written from Amelia Jenks to Sandra Jenks. Now, Amelia Jenks lives in Tennessee. Sandra Jenks lives in Macon, Georgia. Okay. And your little niece is growing like a weed. Awful, AWFULL, big for only 2 with the number. She has blue eyes like her daddy and my blonde hair. There's no E on the blonde. It's the wrong type of blonde. But that will probably, but it's spelled Porubly, go dark. It'll probably go dark. Still, she's awful pretty, and I think sometimes when she is asleep, how she looks like our mama. The other day, while, spelled Wile, she was playing, no G, in the dirt beside the house. I sneaked, not snuck, I sneaked around the house and saw the funniest thing, spelled Funnnyest. Annie was playing with her brother's marbles, only they was moving, Mooving, all by themselves. Themselfs. Now, is there anything necessarily wrong with presenting a character as not having a great grasp on the English language? No, there's nothing wrong with that. I will say this is a trope that seems to rise time and again in Stephen King. People from the Midwest, people from the South, not very bright. Here's the problem I have with it. You can make that commentary if you want. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I'm an adult. You want to say everybody from Kansas City, Missouri is adult, okay, but you'd better have your I's dotted and your T's crossed, because there's one literary critic who's going to make fun of you as well. But so this is a stereotype about people from the South. This is a stereotype that they're stupid and they don't know the English language, the only language they speak. They can't spell, they can't write, they don't know real words. It's a stereotype. There's nothing wrong with having a character in your book that has stereotypical somethings about them. When that character is the only representative of the stereotyped population, it becomes, and I'm not the type to make arguments about quote-unquote problematic, but it becomes something that seems judgmental. You have a white man in your novel that explains things to people and is pedantic. Okay, fine, no one cares. If the only white man in your novel is pedantic and explains things to people, is condescending, then it becomes a stereotype. You have all of the white men in your novel explaining things to people and being pedantic and condescending, it becomes a stereotype. You can pick any stereotype about any type of people that you want. There's no crime in that representation unless it is the only character of said group, or all characters of said group are presented that way. Pretend that there were a stereotype about, and I'm trying to keep away from talking about ugly stereotypes on my channel, right? I just don't want to get into that. But say that there were a stereotype about white men, because that's what I am. Don't know if you could notice. There was a stereotype about white men that they were all drunk, right? They were drunks. White men are alcoholics. Say that that was a stereotype. That is an ugly stereotype. That's an ugly stereotype about certain groups of people. I don't think that's the stereotype about white men. I'm just going to assume it for this conversation. You have a novel that has a lot of characters in it. There's a lot of characters in this novel, and there's a white man who's an alcoholic. That's fine. That is just a character. If you have a novel where all the characters are green, and there's one white man, and he's an alcoholic, well, now it's a stereotype. You have a novel where there are half of the characters are black women, half of the characters are white men, and all of the white men are alcoholics. Then you're talking about a stereotype. You're just playing in the stereotype. The Southerner who writes that letter, so far as I can remember, is the only Southerner that happens in this novel. Now, the same idea. You have that novel about that's half black women, half white men, and all of the white men are alcoholic, but some of the black women are alcoholics too. Well, now it's not a stereotype. Maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps I'm mistaken. My powers of memory are not quite what they once were. 7.5, 8 years of working overnights will do that to you, but I don't remember anyone else in this novel, all from the look down the edge of their nose northeast of the United States, writes Stephen King. All of the other characters in this novel speak with actual words. And then we are presented with a character from the South who doesn't know English, just has no idea, no grasp of the language. That's where it becomes an issue, sort of, maybe. There are 3 talking points from this portion of the novel that I think are worth getting into. Now, the first one is the very first page of this third portion of the novel. It is the death certificate itself. I think so the big question there is whether or not you would have the leeway to have a publisher play along, especially if this was your first novel, to essentially put a picture in the book. That takes a lot of extra work, that takes a lot of extra formatting. But what I really want to talk about is the effectiveness of this. Does this work? Is it a good or at least compelling decision from the author to put that in there? I think yes. Now, first off, the one thing that it really does up front is it gets rid of any funny business that could be lingering in the background from our reader's point of view. This says that there's no Carrie wandering around in the forest. There's no big jump scare at the end. This is done. And that's the second thing to talk about. This is cold. This is distant. This is final. This is all there is to be about Carrie White. There's no more. Carrie White is done. We have her death certificate. So I think that from that point of view, it's a very interesting choice, especially so the third portion of this novel is very short. Obviously, it's the shortest section of the novel, but there's still stuff to be read afterwards. So from the reader's point of view, you have a novel titled Carrie, and the third part of the book begins with confirmation that she is dead. This could be a very so I think that a lot of editors would be tempted to tell you to cut it there. You've got part 1 and part 2 of your novel. This third portion is kind of throwaway. Nothing really gets accomplished from a reader's perspective here. What do we need from that third portion? Stephen King was allowed that third portion despite the fact that this was his first novel, the novel that made him, the novel that allowed him to quit teaching. And because he was allowed that third portion, we get a little bit of extra juice at the end. Would this be a cleaner copy, a cleaner book, a cleaner presentation without that third section? I think there's an argument to be made that yes, it would, though we do have a stinger at the end, which is the second part here on page 289 and 290 of the standard print version here. And your little niece is growing like a weed, awfully big for only 2. She has blue eyes like her daddy and my blonde hair, but that will probably go dark. Still, she's awful pretty, and I think sometimes when she is asleep how she looks like our mama. The other day, while I was playing in the dirt beside the house, I sneaked around and saw the funniest thing. Annie was playing with her brother's marbles, only they was moving around all by themselves. We have a stinger and a setup for a second novel. Where is the novel for Annie Jinx? That is the child named in this portion. Now, that is something of a modern day compulsion. That question is something of a modern day compulsion. If this novel were published today, Stephen King would probably be prompted as to whether or not he had a 3-book arc, Carrie, Annie Jinx, and then whatever comes next. This was, in the 70s, a bit of a cleaner time for literature. You did not have to have a 3-book series, a 3-book deal, etc. Still, from a writer's perspective, why wouldn't we get that novel of Annie Jinx? Annie Jinx, if we're talking about 1974, would have been in her high school days in the late 80s, early 90s. Would have been an interesting novel, especially because, unless I'm incorrect, her freshman year would have coincided right around with Stephen King's It. So, in the event that It does re-emerge, was it 35 years? She would be in her 50s, so that could be an interesting novel and crossover in its own right. The last thing to talk about here, there are excerpts from so many different places, magazines, novels, articles, academic articles. I don't know why I couldn't think of that, but so many different places we have little quotes from. We have actually excerpts from what appear to be actual congressional hearings. So not literally actually, but in the world of the book, congressional hearings. This becomes, and this I'll get into this a little bit more in the book review portion of this next time we see each other for the Carrie series, a bit of an epistolary novel. Not straight up epistolary, but still there is an epistolary element to this. It's interesting how seldom, I think, we now get epistolary novels. Early in the days of the novel, there was a question as to why this was written down. That's why in the early days you had so many epistolary novels. I believe Dracula is an epistolary novel. Frankenstein has an epistolary element. It is the ramblings of Victor Frankenstein. We have lost that convention. We've come to accept the presentation of literature for the sake of presentation, not necessarily the literature. An interesting turn and quirk in the novel world still. Are there novels that would benefit from the epistolary presentation, or, as we have in Carrie, the semi-epistolary presentation? The obvious answer is yes. Of course, there are places where this could be useful. In my opinion, the bigger question in today's world of writing does not become whether or not you need to present your novel in epistolary fashion, but rather the question of tense, present tense or past tense. That becomes a very big question today. It has to do with whether or not your novel is being told first person, who survives, things like that. I think that the third person present tense can be extremely cumbersome and might be, in fact, look, I have a master's degree in creative writing. Anytime you hand in something that is third person present tense, it gets hounded. So those are the people that end up being editors. Those are the people who end up being literary agents. Those are the people, quite frankly, who end up being critics. And there is, I think, a very large bias against anything beyond first person past tense, first or third person past tense. And because of that, having a main character, or a narrator, that dies the way that Carrie does in the second part really, of this novel becomes something you can't really do. It is difficult to be a first-person novel until that last chapter, because you know exactly what happens, therefore, in that last chapter. So that is something that is, if you've never gone back and had to change the tense on a manuscript, then I envy you, because it is a pain and a half.